Good evening and welcome back to the dark. If this is your first night with me, I tell long, slow stories about the things human beings have built, at a pace slow enough to lose yourself inside. And I have found that a story about something enormous, told quietly enough, is one of the kindest ways I know to fall asleep. Tonight we are going to build something taller than almost anything else ever raised by human hands, so there is no need to rush toward it. Get yourself settled the way you like best. Pull the blanket up, let the room go properly dark. Set your phone face down somewhere across the room so it can't reach for you. If you feel like it, leave a comment telling me where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. I like picturing all the different clocks ticking along while I talk. Now, let the rest of the day go and come stand with me at the base of something that was built to disappear into the sky. There is a tower in the desert so tall that when the sun sets on the streets below it, the people still working near its summit are standing in full daylight. Down at street level, the light has already gone soft and orange, the shadows stretching long across the pavement, evening settling over the traffic and the low buildings, and the call to prayer drifting up faintly from the mosques scattered through the old part of the city. But high above all of that, near the very top of the building we are here to talk about tonight, the Burj Khalifa, the sun is still sitting comfortably above the horizon, unwilling to set for several more minutes yet. Two people could stand inside the very same building, one near its base and one near its summit, and watch the same sun finish its day at two different times. That gap, felt by people who never left the building at all, is about as close as I can get to telling you what this place is before I've given you a single measurement of it. Picture the city before that tower existed at all, or rather, picture it half existing, the way places do when something enormous is still being decided about them. Imagine standing on a stretch of open sand outside Dubai in the grey hour before sunrise, when the haze that hangs over the Gulf in the warmer months hasn't yet burned off, and everything past a certain distance dissolves into a pale, featureless gold. You would have heard the city before you saw much of it, a low hum of traffic already building somewhere behind you, a crane motor coughing to life, the particular quiet of a desert morning that hasn't decided yet whether it belongs to the night or the day. And if you look toward where the tower would eventually stand, there would have been, for a long while, nothing there at all. Just sand and surveyors' stakes driven at careful intervals, and men arriving in pickup trucks before the heat made the work unbearable. 3 people are going to walk with us through this whole story, on and off, and I want to introduce you to them now, quietly, before the noise of construction gets too loud to hear anyone speak. The first is an architect named Adrian Smith, an American who had already spent decades designing tall buildings by the time Dubai came looking for someone to design its tallest, and who carried in his head by then a private catalogue of ideas about how a building could rise without simply getting wider and wider as it climbed, the way a pencil sharpened too many times eventually just disappears. The second is a structural engineer named Bill Baker, a quieter sort of figure, the kind of man whose name rarely appears in the newspapers even when his work is the reason a building can stand up at all. And it was Bill who would spend years worrying about wind so that the rest of us never had to. And the third person walking with us tonight will not have a name at all because the record never gave him one. A foreman who oversaw one of the concrete crews on the lower floors. One of many thousands of men who came from far away to build this thing with their hands and then went home again or didn't, and whose individual stories were never written down anywhere official. I will keep coming back to him in a general way because I think it matters that we do. But how do you even begin building something like this? Where does a person drive the first stake for a tower that will eventually stand higher than anything else on Earth? You might imagine there would be some ceremony to it, some sense of occasion. But from what the record shows, the earliest work looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Men with surveying equipment, tripods set into the sand, strings pulled taut between markers, the kind of quiet, fussy, unglamorous labor that happens before any building anywhere gets its first shovel of earth moved. The desert does not announce that it is about to become something else. It simply sits there, indifferent, while people argue over decimal points on a drawing. The site itself sat a little apart from what was, at the time, the beating heart of the city. Close enough to the coastline to catch the humidity rolling in off the Gulf, far enough inland that it would eventually rise clear of everything around it and become its own kind of landmark, visible from the highway, from the sea, from airplane windows on the approach into the airport. If you had stood there in the very early going, you would have felt the heat first, before you noticed anything about the future scale of the place. A heat that presses against your skin like something with weight to it, that makes the horizon shimmer and blur, that turns even simple tasks like carrying a folder of drawings across a lot into a small trial of endurance. And underneath that heat, underneath your boots, was sand that looked solid enough to the eye, but that everyone involved already understood to be the real problem waiting to be solved. We'll get to that soon enough. The ground beneath a building this heavy has its own long story, and it deserves its own quiet hour later on. For now, it's enough to know that the sand was watching, in its way, long before the tower gave it anything to hold up. Adrian Smith had been asked, in the broadest terms, to design something without real precedent, which is a strange kind of assignment to be given, because there is no established language for a building that intends to be the tallest thing anyone has built. You can't simply take the tallest building that already exists and stretch it the way you might lengthen a recipe to feed more people, because buildings do not behave that way, wind does not behave that way, gravity does not behave that way, and a shape that is stable and sensible at a certain height starts to fight against itself once you keep adding floors past the point anyone had tested. So the question Adrian was actually being asked, underneath all the polite language of architectural briefs and client meetings, was something closer to what shape doesn't fall over and doesn't sway so badly that the people living in it get seasick, and still manages to look like something worth building at all, rather than a fat concrete stump reaching resentfully for the sky. He found his answer, in part, in a flower. Not directly, not as a single sudden inspiration the way these stories sometimes get told afterward for the sake of a tidy narrative. But there was a real and recorded connection between the tower's eventual footprint and the shape of a regional desert flower called the Hymenocallis, a plant with slender petals radiating outward from a central point, each one distinct and yet clearly part of the same unified whole. Adrian had used a related idea before, on an earlier tower he'd designed, and he carried the logic of it with him to Dubai, a building made not of one solid mass, but of 3 separate lobes, wings, whatever word you prefer, all growing up out of the same Y-shaped floor plan and joined at a central core, each wing set back from the others as the building climbed, so that the whole structure narrowed and turned and reshaped itself continuously on its way up, rather than simply repeating one flat silhouette, floor after identical floor, all the way to the top. It's a strange thing to picture from ground level, because most tall buildings we're used to seeing look roughly the same shape at floor 10 as they do at floor 80. This one wasn't going to. This one was going to keep quietly changing its mind about its own outline the entire way up. And that changing, it turns out, wasn't just an aesthetic flourish for the sake of a nicer silhouette against the skyline, though it certainly gave the building its now famous, tapering, almost sculptural profile. The setbacks did something else entirely, something Bill Baker cared about far more than the way the tower would photograph. Each time one of the wings stepped back and the building's cross-section changed, it broke up the pattern that wind would otherwise use against it. Wind, when it hits a very tall, uniform shape, doesn't simply push against it in one steady direction. It curls around the sides and forms vortices, swirling little eddies of air that peel off the building at a certain rhythm and can begin to make the whole structure sway in time with them. The same way a flag doesn't just get pushed by wind but flutters, oscillates, finds its own resonant rhythm with the air moving past it. A building tall enough and unlucky enough in its shape can find itself swaying in time with those vortices in a way that gets worse rather than better as they reinforce each other. And no one wanted to discover that lesson the hard way, half a mile above the sand, with people living and working inside. so the constantly shifting outline wasn't decoration. It was a quiet, patient argument with the wind, conducted in concrete and glass rather than words, and we'll spend a good long while later tonight sitting inside that argument, because it is one of the more beautiful pieces of engineering reasoning I've ever come across, and I don't want to rush through it now. If you're already drifting a little, that's fine. None of this needs to be held onto, and it will all still be here waiting if your attention wanders off and comes back later. Somewhere in an office in Chicago, around this same period, Bill Baker was doing the work that would let all of this stand up, sketching what he eventually called a buttressed core, a central hexagonal spine with the three wings braced against it like a tripod holding itself steady, each wing supporting the others the way three people leaning inward can stand more solidly together than any one of them could stand alone. It's an old idea in a sense, older than skyscrapers, older than concrete even. The logic of a tripod, of mutual bracing, of shapes that hold each other up rather than standing alone against the sky. What was new was doing it at a scale nobody had tried, with a material that had its own opinions about how high it was willing to be pushed, in a climate that would test every mixture and every pore in ways the engineers back in Chicago could only estimate from their desks, thousands of miles from the sand where the foreman and his crews were about to find out, floor by floor, exactly how far theory and desert heat were willing to agree with each other. You would not have known, standing on the coast road in those years, that anyone intended to change the skyline at all. Dubai in the early years of this century still read, from a distance, like a low band of white and glass laid flat against the water, a trading port that had done well for itself and was not yet finished deciding what it wanted to be. The oil had never been the real foundation here, not in the way it was further along the Gulf, and the men who ran the city knew it better than anyone. What they had instead was position, a harbour, a crossroads, an old habit of trading pearls and spices, and now something less tangible, the promise of a place worth flying to. If you had walked the creek at dusk in those years, past the wooden dhows still being loaded by hand the way they had been for 100 years before, you might have felt two cities standing in the same set of footprints, one of them finishing its work for the day and the other only just deciding to exist. The man behind that second city was Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. And by the time this story properly begins, he had already spent the better part of 2 decades pushing Dubai toward an idea that had very little precedent anywhere in the world, that a desert port with a shrinking oil reserve could reinvent itself as something people would cross oceans simply to look at. He had backed the artificial islands taking shape offshore, the indoor ski slope, the hotel built to look like a sail. Each of these was, in its own way, a rehearsal. Height was the idea he kept returning to, because height does something that other kinds of ambition cannot quite do. It is visible from 100 miles out, it needs no translation, and it announces itself to a stranger's eye before that stranger has read a single word about the place. A tower, if it were tall enough, would not need to explain Dubai. It would simply be the tallest proof that Dubai existed, and that was a form of national identity you could see from an airplane window long before you landed. It is worth sitting with that logic for a moment, quietly, because it is the seed of everything that follows in this story. And there is nothing you need to hold on to here beyond the shape of it. A country without ancient monuments cannot borrow the past to make itself remarkable. But a country with money, ambition, and patience can commission the future instead, and can do it at a scale nobody had thought to attempt. That was the wager. Not simply a landmark, but the landmark. The one structure that would, for as long as anyone could measure such things, sit above every other structure on Earth. The task of turning that wager into an actual building fell to Emaar Properties, the development company that had already been reshaping large stretches of the city with housing and retail, and had the local relationships, the capital access, and the appetite for scale that a project like this would require. Under the chairmanship of Mohammed Al-Abar, Emaar had grown accustomed to thinking in whole neighborhoods rather than single plots. And it was Emaar that would carry the commercial weight of the tower, assembling the financing, absorbing the risk, answering eventually to buyers and investors who wanted apartments and hotel suites in a building that did not yet have a settled height, a settled shape, or even in truth a settled way of being built at all. The project was given a working name that tied it to the city itself, Burj Dubai, the Tower of Dubai, though it would carry that name for only part of its life before a different set of circumstances gave it the one the world now knows. What Emar and the Sheikh had agreed to, in effect, was not a target height. It was an open bet with no ceiling. Every other tall building in the world's history had been built to beat a specific rival, one nation's tower answering another's, one century's steel frame outreaching the last century's masonry. This one was commissioned differently. It was to be built as tall as it could reasonably be built, whatever that number turned out to be, and the number itself would be allowed to move as the design matured. If you have ever tried to plan something without knowing exactly how large it will become, a garden that might be a bed or might be an orchard, a boat that might be a skiff or might need a proper keel, you will recognize the peculiar discomfort of that kind of commission. Nobody involved could yet say, with any confidence, how tall was too tall. That question had never been asked at this scale before, so there was no answer sitting in a drawer waiting to be pulled out. There was only the decision to keep asking it, floor by floor, for as long as the engineering allowed, so the wager had a patron and it had a builder. What it did not yet have in those early conversations was anybody who had the faintest idea of how such a thing might actually be shaped. Which raises the question that must have hung over every one of those early meetings, unspoken at first and then increasingly impossible to avoid. If you are going to attempt the tallest structure ever built by human hands, whose drafting table do you put it on? The answer, when it came, led back to Chicago, to a firm called Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, and to an architect named Adrian Smith, whose reputation by this point in his career had already been built, in the most literal sense, floor upon floor upon floor. Smith had spent much of his working life inside the particular discipline of the tall building, not simply drawing towers that looked impressive from the street, but understanding in his bones the way a building's shape changes its relationship with wind, with its own weight, with the very idea of what a structure is allowed to do as it climbs. He had already put his name to some of the more ambitious skyscrapers going up in Asia during those years, buildings that had themselves briefly held claims to being among the tallest anywhere. And if you had asked other architects in that period to name the people capable of thinking clearly at heights where ordinary intuition stops being reliable, his name would have come up early and often. The call that brought him into this particular story is the kind of moment that never quite makes it into the official record with the texture it deserves. No transcript survives of the conversation, no diary entry describing the exact words used, but the broad shape of it is not in dispute. Emar and the Dubai government wanted a design for the tallest building in the world, and they wanted the person doing the designing to already understand what that phrase actually costs a structure, rather than someone who would have to learn it while the concrete was already being poured. Smith took the commission, and with it came a partnership that would matter as much as his own contribution. The firm's structural engineer, a man named Bill Baker, whose particular way of thinking about how a tall building holds itself up would end up shaping this tower more than almost anything else in its story. That part of the record, though, belongs to what comes next. For now, imagine only the first weeks of that arrangement, before any of the engineering had settled into certainty. Imagine Smith with a blank sheet in front of him and a brief that amounted, more or less, to build higher than anyone else ever has, in a place where the ground is sand, where summer heat can soften a man's judgment as easily as it softens asphalt, and where no one, not the client, not the architect, not the engineer standing beside him, yet knew what shape could carry that much weight that far into the sky without the wind simply taking it apart at the top. If your eyes are already growing heavy, that uncertainty is not something you need to solve tonight, only something worth feeling for a moment, the way the people in that room must have felt it. A genuine gap between what had been promised and what anyone could yet prove was possible. That gap is where the next part of this story properly begins. Not with a foundation being dug or a single stone laid, but with a shape. Because before any of the sand could be tested, before any concrete could be mixed for a desert this unforgiving, somebody first had to answer the quieter, stranger question sitting underneath all the ambition. What form exactly could a building take that would let it stand half a mile into the sky without simply falling over under its own restless weight? You might think a question that large would begin with calculations, but it began instead with looking Smith and the small group of designers around him turning to what already stood and what already grew, and what had already survived heat and wind for longer than any engineer had been alive to study it. There is a particular kind of research that happens not in a laboratory but in a library of images. And in those first weeks, that is largely what the work looked like. Photographs of desert flowers pinned beside photographs of old minarets, sketches of shells and spiral staircases laid next to elevation drawings of buildings that had briefly, and only briefly, held some claim to being the tallest of their own era. If you had been standing in that drafting room, you would have seen very little that looked like a skyscraper yet. You would have seen a man trying to find a shape in nature patient enough to hold its own weight against a wind it could not see coming. That is the quieter question worth turning over for a moment. Why look at a flower at all when the thing being built was steel and glass and reinforced concrete? The answer has to do with a very old problem that every tall building eventually meets, whether its architect knows the botany or not. A single unbroken profile rising straight into the sky presents the wind with one wide, uninterrupted surface to push against, and the taller that surface grows, the more violently the wind wants to argue with it. A desert flower, folded into itself, tapering as it rises, offered something else, a shape that could change its face to the air at every level, never quite giving the wind the same target twice. Smith carried that instinct back to Chicago, where it would meet a different kind of mind entirely, one less interested in the poetry of the shape and rather more interested in whether that shape could actually be persuaded to stand. That meeting between an architect's eye for form and an engineer's eye for load is where this story turns next, because the flower on the drafting table was still, for now, only a beautiful guess. The competition itself had been a quiet, almost bureaucratic affair, the kind of process that never quite matches the scale of what it produces. Emaar, the Dubai developer with land and ambition and very little patience for delay, had put the commission out to the handful of firms in the world capable of even entertaining the idea of building past the point where anyone else had stopped. You would not have seen much of that competition if you had been standing on the site itself, because there was as yet no site to stand on in any meaningful sense, just flat ground on the edge of the city, marked out with stakes and string, waiting to find out what it was for. The real contest was happening thousands of miles away, in conference rooms and drafting offices, where teams from several countries were sketching towers that existed, for the moment, only as lines on paper and numbers in a proposal binder. Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill had a name that meant something in this kind of contest, the way an old shipyard's name might have meant something to a 19th-century merchant deciding where to have his vessel built. The firm had already put up towers that had, for a time, held the record for the tallest in the world, and there is a particular kind of confidence that comes from having done a thing before, even if the thing you are now being asked to do is considerably harder than the last one. Confidence, though, is not the same as certainty, and everyone in that Chicago office understood the difference. You do not win a commission like this by promising something safe. You win it, if you win it at all, by promising something that has never quite existed, and then spending the following years proving that the promise was not reckless. The man who carried that particular weight of imagination was Adrian Smith, an architect who had spent a career thinking about how a very tall building might be made to feel less like a fact of engineering and more like a piece of the landscape it stood in. He was not, by his own account and by the accounts of those who worked alongside him, a man drawn first to steel and load paths. He was drawn to shape, and on this project, shape needed to come from somewhere honest, somewhere rooted, rather than from the abstract vocabulary of glass boxes stacked on top of each other that so many tall buildings had settled for out of simple exhaustion. If you had walked into the design studio in those early weeks, you might have found, pinned among the technical diagrams and the site surveys, sketches that looked almost nothing like a building at all. Smith had gone looking for inspiration in the region itself, rather than importing something foreign and dropping it onto the sand. And what he found, what the story of this tower keeps returning to again and again in every serious account of how it came to look the way it looks, was a flower, not an exotic one. A regional desert bloom, the kind that grows low and modest against harsh ground, its petals arranged in overlapping, ascending layers, each one set slightly apart from the one below it, spiraling gently as it reaches upward toward whatever light the desert offers. It is called the Hymenocalyx, though you would be forgiven for never having heard the name before tonight, and you do not need to hold on to it now. What matters is the shape it gave him, and the shape it would eventually give the skyline of an entire city. There is something quietly moving about that if you sit with it for a moment in the dark. A building meant to be the tallest thing human hands had ever raised did not begin with an engineer's calculation. It began with someone crouching, in effect, to look closely at a small flower that most people would have walked past without a second glance, and asking what it might mean to grow the way that flower grew. Not stacked, not merely piled higher and higher, but layered, tapering, turning gently as it climbed, each level a little different from the one beneath it, never repeating itself all the way up. Smith's early sketches from this period are still spoken of by those who study the building's history, and if you could see them now, quick pencil studies, not yet architecture so much as an argument being made to himself, you would notice how little they resemble a finished tower and how much they resemble exactly what he was looking at. Petals, layered and spiraling, drawn over and over until the gesture started to feel less like a flower and more like something that could plausibly hold itself up against the sky. It is worth pausing on that word, plausibly, because at this stage nothing had been tested, nothing had been proven. This was still, in the truest sense, a beautiful guess, sketched by a man betting that nature had already solved a problem that engineers were about to spend years solving formally. You do not need to remember any of the botanical names or the precise geometry of petal arrangement to feel what this section is really about. It is about the moment before certainty, the sketch before the calculation, the idea before the load path, and if your eyes have already begun to close somewhere in this telling, that is exactly the right place to be resting, because the story itself is still resting here too, still hovering in that soft space between imagination and proof. But how does a flower drawn on a page become a floor plan that an engineer could actually trust his numbers to? That was the real question waiting on the other side of Smith's sketches, and it is the question that turned this from an exercise in inspiration into an exercise in geometry. The answer that emerged over weeks of drafting and redrafting was a Y-shaped footprint, 3 wings extending outward from a central core, meeting at angles that, on the page, looked almost like a gesture rather than a plan. If you had leaned over the drafting table at that stage, you might have assumed the Y-shape was chosen purely for how it looked from above, a pleasing asymmetry rather than a stack of identical flaws. And it is true that the shape carried an elegance that pure function alone would not have demanded. But elegance was never the whole reason it survived every revision that followed, and it is worth sitting with why. Because the reason is one of those quiet pieces of engineering logic that rewards patience rather than excitement. A tower that simply rises as a square or a circle, floor after identical floor, presents the wind with the same shape at every level, over and over, all the way up. And wind, as anything this tall would eventually have to answer to, does not like to be given the same shape twice. It settles into that repetition. It finds a rhythm in it, the way water finds a rhythm in a repeated obstacle, and that rhythm is precisely what a very tall, very slender structure cannot afford to give it. A Y-shaped plan, tapering and setting back as it climbs, offers no such gift. Each wing could be foreshortened at different heights. Terraces could be introduced where a wing simply stopped rising, and the building's face to the sky could shift, subtly, floor by floor, so that the wind arriving at any given height would find something slightly different from what it found 100 feet below. You could think of it, if you wanted a plain way to hold on to it before sleep takes you, as a building that never quite lets the air get comfortable. There was a second, quieter virtue to the Y shape as well, one that had nothing to do with wind and everything to do with simple daylight. Three wings meeting at a central core meant that almost every room in the tower, however high it sat, could have a window with an actual view outward rather than staring into an internal shaft or a neighboring wing. For a building meant to hold homes and offices and hotel rooms by the thousand, that was not a small consideration. It meant the tower was not only a shape that resisted the wind, it was a shape that people could actually live inside without feeling as though they had been filed away into a slot. Through this period, the project carried a working name that told you something about how it was regarded even by the people building it. It was called simply Burj Dubai, the Tower of Dubai, a name with no promises folded into it beyond the city it belonged to. There was no claim yet to height records, no borrowed name from anywhere else, just the plain fact of what it was and where it stood. If you had asked around the drafting rooms in Chicago or the developers' offices in Dubai what people actually thought of it in those months, you would have found confidence and doubt sitting comfortably in the same rooms, sometimes in the same conversations. Confidence, because the shape solved real problems and looked, even in sketch form, like nothing else being built anywhere in the world. Doubt, because a sketch inspired by a flower and a floor plan shaped like a Y are, on their own, still just ideas, untested against wind loads that did not yet have final numbers, unproven against a height that kept creeping upward in internal discussions as ambition outpaced the paper it was drawn on. That tension, between what looked right and what could be proven right, is not unusual at this stage of any large structure's life, and there is no need for you to hold on to the details of it now. It is enough to know that it was there, quietly, in every meeting, the way a held breath is there beneath an ordinary conversation. What happened next was the natural and necessary consequence of that tension. The architects had done what architects do at their best. They had found a shape that felt inevitable, that seemed to belong to its place and its purpose in a way that no amount of later justification could have manufactured after the fact. But a shape that feels inevitable is not yet a structure that stands, and Adrian Smith knew this as well as anyone in the room. The sketches, the Y-shaped plan, the tapering silhouette borrowed from a desert flower, all of it now had to leave the hands that had imagined it and pass into the hands of people whose entire discipline was built around a much colder question. Not whether the shape was beautiful, but whether the shape could survive. That handoff is where the story turns next, from the drafting room in Chicago toward the harder, quieter work of bracing something this tall against a wind that had never before had to be reasoned with at this height, and toward the engineer whose calculations would decide whether the flower on the page could ever truly stand in the sand. The man who received that drawing did not think in petals or minarets. William Baker, known to the small circle of engineers who had worked beside him for years, simply as Bill, thought in loads and moments, in the slow arithmetic of wind pressing against a wall for decades on end. Had you walked into his office in those first weeks, you would not have found a rendering of the tower's silhouette pinned above his desk. You would have found columns of numbers, degrees of sway calculated against wind speeds that no one could yet promise, for a building that did not yet have an engineering answer to match its architectural ambition. Adrian Smith had given the tower its shape. Now it fell to Baker to ask the harder question underneath that shape, not whether it looked like it could stand, but whether, half a mile into a sky that no structure had ever occupied before, it actually would. The trouble was not gravity. Gravity, for an engineer of Baker's experience, was almost restful, a force you could calculate with confidence, a straight line pulling straight down, obedient and unsurprising. The trouble was wind, and more precisely, it was what wind does to something very tall and very slender that gravity alone would never do. A tower half a mile high does not simply resist a gust the way a low, squat building resists one. It sways. It bends slightly at the top the way a fishing rod bends when you lift a heavy weight on the end of it, and if the wind arrives in gusts that match the building's own natural rhythm of sway, that gentle bending can become something else entirely. A building rocking in time with the air around it, each gust adding to the last rather than cancelling it out. And a tower this slim carries a second, quieter danger alongside the sway. It can twist ever so slightly along its own vertical axis, the way a tall stack of coins will rotate if you push unevenly near the top. Neither motion needed to be violent to be a problem. It only needed to be perceptible, night after night, to the people who would eventually live and work inside it. You do not have to imagine the physics to feel the stakes. You only have to imagine trying to sleep in a room that never quite stops moving. Baker's answer, when it came, was not a single clever trick so much as a shape borrowed from the way trees survive wind that would otherwise snap them. At the very center of the tower, he placed a hexagonal core, 6 walls of reinforced concrete rising together like the trunk of that tree, carrying much of the building's own weight straight down toward the ground. But a trunk alone, however strong, will still whip in a storm if nothing braces it. So, around that hexagonal core, Baker wrapped 3 wings, each one a wall of concrete reaching outward from the center, like a buttress leaning against a cathedral nave, except that here the buttresses were not stone holding up stone from the outside. They were built into the tower itself, 3 arms bracing one spine. Engineers would come to call it the buttressed core, and though the phrase sounds technical enough to skim past in the dark, the idea underneath it is almost plain enough to picture without effort. 3 walls, angled away from the center at 120 degrees from one another, each one steadying the others the way 3 fingers pressed together stand straighter than 1 finger alone. Wind striking the tower from any direction would always find at least one of those wings turned to meet it, absorbing the push and passing it down into the ground rather than letting it accumulate at the top. There is something almost peaceful in this kind of engineering, if you let yourself sit with it rather than rush past it. Baker was not trying to make the tower immovable. Nothing that tall, built from concrete and steel and glass, is ever perfectly still, and no engineer who has spent real time on real buildings would ever promise stillness. He was trying to make it patient, to give it a structure so evenly braced in 3 directions that whatever the wind decided to do, the tower would absorb it calmly, distribute it downward, and settle. If your eyes have already started to close somewhere in this description, that is exactly the right response to have to it. This was, in its way, an engineering of calm, worked out over long nights in a drafting office not unlike the quiet room you are lying in now. But knowing the general shape of a solution and knowing it will actually work at this height are 2 very different kinds of knowing, and no amount of arithmetic alone could settle the second. Baker's numbers told him the buttressed core should behave. They did not yet tell him how the wind over the Arabian Gulf, in all its restless, shifting moods, would actually behave when it met a shape this tall standing alone on a flat desert plain with nothing around it to soften the gusts. So, how do you test a building against a wind that has never before had the chance to meet anything like it? You cannot ask the real wind to wait patiently while you check your math, and you certainly cannot build the tower itself and hope. What Baker's team did instead was build a very small, very careful lie of a tower, a scale model exact down to its proportions, standing in a wind tunnel at a laboratory built specifically for testing how tall structures answer moving air. Fans generated wind at controlled speeds across the little model, sensors recorded every twitch and sway, and engineers watched over and over, sending gusts from every direction the real desert sky might one day produce. If you had stood in that laboratory, you would have heard the low, steady hum of the fans long before you noticed the tower itself, no taller than a lamp, trembling almost imperceptibly on its instrumented base. The early tests, by most accounts, were not entirely reassuring. A tower shaped like a smooth, unbroken, tapering spire, however elegant it looked in Adrian Smith's drawings, gave the wind something dangerously easy to work with. Wind moving past a tall, smooth shape tends to peel away from its surface in swirling pockets called vortices. And if those vortices begin shedding off the building at a steady rhythm, they can start to push the structure back and forth in time with their own rhythm. Exactly the kind of resonant sway Baker had been trying to avoid from the very beginning. A smooth tower, in other words, can accidentally teach the wind how to shake it. The solution that emerged from those tests was one of the quieter kinds of brilliance in the tower's whole design. Rather than trying to build something so rigid it could simply resist the wind head-on, Baker's team let the tower's own floor plan change gradually as it climbed, each of the three wings stepping inward at intervals on its way up, so that the building's cross-section grew slightly smaller and slightly different in outline every so many floors. Seen from above, the tower does not repeat the same shape twice all the way up. It spirals inward in a sequence of setbacks, each one placed at a different point around the hexagonal core than the one below it. The effect, when the wind meets it, is that no single, steady rhythm of vortices can ever fully form. The air sheds off the building's edges at different points, at different heights, in a way that never quite settles into the kind of matched, repeating pulse that had worried the engineers in the laboratory. The tower does not fight the wind so much as refuse to give it anything consistent to push against, confusing it gently and continuously, floor after floor, rather than resisting it in any one place. You could stand at the base of the finished tower one day and never once notice this happening above your head, and that quiet invisibility was, in a sense, the entire point. None of this took shape in isolation, and it is worth pausing on how much of it grew out of long hours spent by two very different men in the same room. Adrian Smith had drawn a tower that stepped inward as it rose, tier after tier, echoing the layered petals of a desert flower he had studied before he ever picked up a pencil for Dubai. Baker, working through the wind tunnel results, needed exactly that kind of stepping geometry to break up the air moving past the building, and so architecture and structure, which so often pull against each other on a project this ambitious, found themselves quietly pulling in the same direction instead. Smith's setbacks were not simply permitted to remain in the final design because they were beautiful. They were, in Baker's calculations, doing real work, deflecting the wind at each change of profile. And Baker's buttressed core, in turn, allowed Smith's tower to taper as dramatically as it did, narrowing toward the sky rather than standing as a single unbroken slab, because the three wings bracing the hexagonal center meant the building did not need to rely on sheer bulk for its stability. Across long design sessions that stretched over months, the two men's decisions kept folding back into one another this way, an architect's instinct for form and an engineer's instinct for load meeting somewhere in the middle and shaping each other until neither piece of the design could be pulled apart from the other without the whole thing losing sense. By the time the drawings reached something close to their final form, the tower on paper had a name for its structural logic, the buttressed core spiraling upward through a sequence of setbacks, and it had passed, as well as any design ever can, through the scrutiny of the wind tunnel. Baker's numbers now showed a building that should sway gently under a design wind, twist only slightly, and shed the air moving past it without ever settling into a rhythm the tower's own frame might amplify. It was, on paper, a tower that had made peace with the wind before a single foot of it existed in the desert. But paper peace is not the same as ground peace. And everyone in that drafting room in Chicago understood that the calculations answering the question of the sky said nothing at all about the question waiting underneath the site itself. Whether the loose, shifting sand of Dubai could be trusted to hold without complaint the enormous and precisely calculated weight that Baker and Smith had just finished agreeing on between them. Long before the tower had a shape anyone would have recognized from a photograph, it had a problem. And the problem was the ground itself. You would have felt it before you understood it, if you had walked that stretch of desert in the early-going sea, a give underfoot that had nothing to do with the loose surface sand, a softness that seemed to travel upward through your legs the longer you stood still and thought about it. Dubai sits on land that was, in the long memory of the earth, simply seabed, and the ground still carries that memory close to the surface. Beneath the dunes and the newly graded lots lay layers of sand and silt and weak, weathered rock, and not far beneath those lay water, not a trickle, but a broad, patient sheet of it, pressing quietly up against anything that dared to be built above it. This was not a site chosen because the ground was hospitable. It was chosen because the city needed a centerpiece, and this was where the city had decided to put one, so the ground would simply have to be persuaded. Every calculation in that Chicago drafting room about wind and sway and the shifting of mass at extraordinary height meant nothing at all if the earth below could not be trusted to hold still under the weight of it. Somebody had to go and find out, quietly, patiently, what was actually down there, long before anyone could speak with any confidence about a shape rising out of this particular patch of desert at all. You would have seen the drilling rigs before you saw anything resembling a tower site. Small, patient machines standing in a rough grid across empty ground, turning slowly, pulling up long cores of sand and clay and rock for men in hard hats to lay out on trestle tables and study like evidence in a case that had not yet gone to trial. This was geotechnical investigation, unglamorous and essential, the part of the story that never makes it into a photograph of a finished skyline. Engineers were reading the ground the way a doctor reads a chart, borehole by borehole, trying to understand not what the sand looked like on the surface, but what it would do over years under a load heavier than anything the region had ever asked its earth to carry. What they found was not encouraging in the way a builder might have hoped. The upper layers were loose and compressible, prone to settling unevenly if pressed too hard in one place and not another. Somewhere well below that lay firmer material, a kind of weak rock the engineers could work with, layered and imperfect but real, and sitting through all of it, rising and falling gently with the season and with the pull of the Gulf itself, was that sheet of groundwater, close enough to the surface that any hole dug into the earth on this site would fill with it almost as soon as you stopped pumping. If you had leaned over the edge of one of those early test pits, you would have watched the water climb the sides quietly, unhurried, entirely uninterested in the schedule anyone had drawn up for it. It was somewhere around this stage of the work that a young rigger first arrived on site, one of the many thousands who would eventually pass through that patch of desert and whose names no official record would trouble itself to keep. He is not a person you can look up. He is a kind of person, standing in for all the others like him. And it is worth saying that plainly now, because he will come back later in this story, on higher ground than this, doing work far more dangerous than watching a drilling rig turn. In those early days there was no tower to speak of, no frame, no glass, nothing that looked like ambition yet. There was only a flat, sun-hardened stretch of land, a scatter of trailers, and men standing around test pits in the early morning before the heat made standing around anything unbearable. He remembers, or the kind of man he represents would have remembered, the particular sound of the drilling rigs, a low, grinding note that carried a long way in the stillness before the site was fully populated, before the traffic of trucks and cranes drowned it out for good. He was there to learn the ground the same way the engineers were, only with his hands rather than his instruments, helping to lay out cable, to move sample crates, to do the small, unglamorous tasks that come before any tall thing is permitted to rise. If your eyes have already grown heavy somewhere in this description of test pits and water tables, that is exactly the right place for them to be. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, only the ground being quietly and thoroughly understood before anyone dared build on it. But how, exactly, do you drive something solid and permanent into ground that would rather flow than hold still, ground with water sitting close enough beneath it to swallow a shovel's depth of trench overnight? The answer the engineers settled on was piling, and not piling in any modest sense. Instead of resting the tower's great weight on a shallow slab, the way a smaller building might, they planned to drive it down, past the loose upper layers, past the point where the ground gave and shifted, into the firmer, weak rock that lay far below. Reinforced concrete piles, each one a slender column of steel and concrete lowered and set deep into a bored shaft, would carry the load downward until it reached material strong enough to be trusted. There would be a great many of them, arranged in a dense grid beneath the tower's footprint, working together the way a forest of tree roots works together to hold a single trunk upright in soft soil. No one passing the site once the tower was finished would ever see them, or think about them, or know they were there at all. And that, in its own quiet way, is the nature of foundation work everywhere. The best of it disappears completely, and its success is measured by nothing at all happening above it for the rest of the building's life. Driving those piles was neither fast nor simple work, and it asked a great deal of patience from everyone standing anywhere near the rigs. Each shaft had to be bored down through layer after layer of that uncooperative sand, held open against collapse, filled with reinforcing steel cages, lowered in with cranes, and then filled again with concrete pumped down from the surface, displacing the water and the loose material as it went. If you had stood at the edge of one of those shafts while a cage went in, you would have felt the ground tremble faintly through your boots as the steel settled, and you would have smelled the wet mineral smell of drilling mud rising up out of the hole, a smell that has nothing pleasant about it and everything necessary. The young rigger and the men working alongside him spent long stretches of those early months simply waiting, watching gauges, watching cranes, watching concrete trucks queue along the access road in a slow, patient line that seemed to stretch back toward the city itself. There is no way to rush ground like this into cooperating. It gives up its trust one shaft at a time, and the only thing to do is keep going, day after day, until the grid beneath the whole footprint is complete. Even once the piles were in and set, the ground still had one more argument to make, and this one came in the form of chemistry rather than mechanics. Dubai's groundwater is not gentle water. It carries salts and sulfates from the ancient seabed the whole region rests upon, and left alone that water will happily eat through ordinary concrete and corrode reinforcing steel from the inside out, slowly and invisibly, until a structure that looks perfectly sound begins to fail in places nobody can see until it is far too late. Engineers understood this danger going in, and it shaped the concrete itself before a single pile was poured. The mixes used across the foundation were formulated specifically to resist that corrosive water. Dense, low-permeability concrete designed to keep the aggressive salts from working their way in, blended and tested and adjusted long before it ever reached a pump. Above and around the piles, a thick, reinforced concrete mat was laid across the entire footprint, a raft spreading the tower's enormous weight evenly across the piled ground beneath it, wrapped in waterproofing membranes meant to keep that patient, rising groundwater exactly where it belonged and nowhere else. None of this would ever be photographed for a magazine. All of it mattered more than almost anything that would come after. There is something quietly moving about work like this if you let yourself sit with it for a moment before drifting further into sleep. An entire invisible structure, as complicated in its own way as anything that would eventually catch the light 40, 50, 60 stories up, existing only to be buried and forgotten, trusted absolutely and never once admired. The young rigger, by the time the mat was finished and the waterproofing sealed beneath it, had already spent the better part of a year learning a site that still had no visible shape to it at all. No columns, no core, nothing rising yet above the level of the ground he had watched being tested, bored, and quietly won over one borehole at a time. He would not have known, standing there in the heat with the mat finally poured and curing beneath tarpaulins, that he was standing on what would one day be the deepest anchored base beneath the tallest thing human beings had ever built. He knew only that the ground had stopped arguing, that the trucks had stopped queuing, and that somewhere above him, in offices far from the site, drawings existed for a frame that could finally begin to climb. The sand had been read, tested, pierced, and answered. What came next would rise not from soil at all, but from concrete mixed to a formula that had never quite been asked to perform this way before. And that story, the story of the material itself, was only just beginning. Somewhere in the mixing yard, a batching engineer was already running trial pours through the night, watching how the paste behaved as the desert air pulled moisture from it faster than any handbook from a cooler climate could have predicted. You would have found him under floodlights long after the piling crews had gone back to camp, holding a slump cone upside down, timing how a grey column of wet concrete settled under its own weight, the way you might time a held breath. What worked in London or Chicago would not simply work here, not with this heat, not with this salt-laced water waiting below. Getting the mixture right was its own quiet campaign, and it would decide everything that followed. The mixture that finally satisfied him was not one recipe, but a family of them, each tuned to a different part of the tower. A leaner blend for the upper floors where the loads would be lighter, a denser, almost stubborn paste for the base, where every square inch would eventually be asked to carry the weight of the floors stacked above it. Cement was only the smallest part of the story. Silica fume, fly ash, and a careful dosing of chemical admixtures went into the mix to slow its heat, to let it flow into the formwork like something poured rather than shoveled, and to seal it tight enough that the salts in the ground below would have nothing to travel through. If you had lowered a hand into a fresh batch on the testing pad, it would have moved around your fingers almost like a thick, cool syrup, self-leveling, needing no one to vibrate or tamp it into place. That single property, the concrete's willingness to find its own level inside the formwork, would save thousands of hours over the life of the build because no one would need to climb inside the forms with vibrating poles to chase out air pockets in a shaft too narrow for a grown man to work comfortably. But a mixture that behaves itself on a test pad in the cool of the evening is not the same as a mixture that behaves itself inside a moving concrete truck at 2 in the afternoon. And this is where the desert made its first serious objection known. Concrete cures through a chemical reaction that gives off its own heat, and in a climate where the ambient temperature could sit above body heat for months at a stretch, that reaction ran away with itself. A slab poured under a midday sun would begin to set before it had even finished being placed, skinning over on top while the middle stayed loose and wet, and a skin like that hides a weakness that no amount of finishing trowel work can undo later. So the decision was made, early and without much argument, that this tower would rise mostly in darkness. The trucks would run at night. If you had stood at the edge of the site sometime after midnight, in that window when the sand finally gives back some of the heat it swallowed all day, you would have found the whole place lit by banks of floodlight, working under a sky gone the color of wet slate, and it would have felt less like construction and more like some quiet industrial ceremony being carried out while the city slept. Trucks queued along the access road with their drums still turning, keeping the mix alive on the drive-in from the batching plant. Before the concrete ever left that plant, it had already been fought over once. Ice, sometimes tens of tons of it a night, crushed and dropped straight into the mixing water, so the batch left the yard already cooled well below the outside air. Chilled water lines ran to the plant as well, and on days when even that was not enough, liquid nitrogen was piped directly into the mixer drums, so that what eventually rolled onto the site could be colder to the touch than the night air around it. A strange kind of comfort in a country built on heat. You do not need to remember any of these figures to follow the story, only the plain, patient logic behind them. Keep the reaction slow, keep the pour honest, and let the desert do what it wanted to. The finished concrete only once it had already found its strength. The pours themselves ran for hours at a stretch, crews working the forms under those floodlights, while the temperature gauges embedded in the fresh concrete were watched as closely as a patient's chart. Someone always ready to slow the delivery if the readings climbed too fast. It was unglamorous, repetitive work. Hour after hour of trucks arriving, chutes swinging, finishers smoothing a surface that had to be flat and honest, because every floor above it would depend on this one being true. And it needed to be trusted completely, because unlike a steel joint you can inspect from the outside, once concrete like this had set inside its formwork, there would be no opening it back up to check. Getting that same mixture into the ground floor slabs was one kind of achievement. Getting it up to where the tower actually needed to grow was another problem altogether, and a harder one. Ordinary construction pumps, the kind used on almost every building site in the world, are built to push concrete a modest distance upward before the friction inside the pipe and the sheer weight of the column of wet material pushing back down simply overwhelm the machine. Nobody had ever needed a pump that could beat that weight all the way to where this tower was heading, because nobody had ever built anything that tall out of concrete before. So the question the engineers found themselves asking night after night was a plain one, even if the answer was not. How do you get something as heavy and reluctant as wet concrete to climb higher than concrete had ever been made to climb? The answer turned out to be a combination of patience and brute, careful engineering. The pumps themselves were built larger and stronger than anything used on a typical site, fed by a mixture designed from the start to be pumpable rather than merely strong, It's aggregate sized and graded so it would not jam or segregate somewhere deep inside hundreds of meters of pipe. The pipe itself ran up the outside of the rising core, strapped and braced at every level, a long steel artery feeding the work far above. Where an ordinary building might need a pump capable of lifting concrete perhaps 100 meters, the crews here needed one that could keep pushing material well past the reach of anything previously attempted anywhere on Earth, and they got it, floor after floor. The record for the highest a single pump had ever sent concrete, broken and then quietly broken again as the tower kept climbing past its own earlier achievements. If you had laid your palm against that pipe during a pour, you would have felt it thrum, faint but constant, the whole line alive with a slow, buried pressure, like something breathing far under the floor. And once that mixture could survive the mixer, the truck, the ice, and the long climb through the pipe, a different kind of question began to matter just as much, because a tower this tall would need more than a skeleton of concrete and steel standing alone against the sky. It would need a skin. Somewhere in the drawing offices, long before the first upper floors were poured, the specifications for that skin were already being drawn up, and they described a covering unlike anything a desert building site had ever been asked to gather in one place. Hundreds of thousands of square meters of glass, and enough aluminum and stainless steel paneling to wrap the whole structure several times over, arriving not from one factory, but from workshops scattered across continents. The glass came reflective and heat-treated, engineered to hold back the worst of the sun's load, while still letting the building read as something bright and near weightless against the sky, rather than a dark monolith. It traveled from manufacturers in more than one country, cut and coated to exact specification before it ever touched Dubai, then crated and shipped by sea in numbers that would have filled entire dockyards with nothing but pallets of panels waiting to be trucked out to the site. The aluminum came the same way, formed into the long vertical fins and spandrels that would eventually catch the light differently depending on the hour and the angle, some of it fabricated in facilities as far away as other continents entirely, cut to a tolerance measured in millimeters because a panel even slightly out of true would show itself instantly against its neighbors, a small dark seam running up the face of the world's tallest thing. Stainless steel fins, meant to reinforce the vertical lines of the tower's silhouette, arrived from yet another set of suppliers, and all of it, glass, aluminum, steel, had to be tracked, stored, and staged in a logistics operation that ran almost as tightly as the concrete pours themselves, because a single missing crate of panels could, months later, leave a visible gap in the skin of a tower rising 1,000 feet above the yard where that crate now sat unopened. None of this cladding would go up for a long while yet. It sat instead in vast staging yards near the site, crate after crate under the sun, glass panels wrapped and stacked in racks, aluminum profiles bundled and tagged, waiting for a structure tall enough to need them. If your mind has already begun to drift, that is no trouble at all. There is nothing urgent happening in this part of the story, only the quiet, patient business of a desert filling up with materials gathered from half the workshops of the world, all of it converging toward a single narrow footprint of sand. Bill Baker, watching the mock-ups of that cladding tested against Dubai's sun and its salt-heavy air, was reportedly satisfied that the skin would do its work quietly for decades without complaint, in the same unshowy way the concrete beneath it was already doing its own. The concrete engineer who had spent those long nights timing slump cones under floodlight was, by this stage, watching a different kind of test. Full-scale mock-ups of wall sections poured and cured exactly as the real floors would be, then loaded and monitored to see whether the mixture born on that testing pad could actually carry what the drawings promised. It could. The ice trucks, the chilled water lines, the pumps straining against their own record heights, all of it had produced, floor sample after floor sample, a material stronger under compression than almost anything used in a building before it, dense enough to seal out the ground salts, cool enough in its curing to avoid the hairline cracking that heat always threatens. By the time the cladding had finished arriving and the concrete mix had finished proving itself, the site had become something closer to a small industrial nation than a construction yard. Its own quarried stone crushed for aggregate, its own batching plants running through the night, its own staging fields of glass and aluminum glinting under a sun that would not touch them again until they were finally lifted into place high above the ground they now rested on. Everything the tower would need to become itself was, at last, gathered, tested, and waiting. What remained was simply to begin sending it upward, floor by floor, in the long and patient rhythm the builders were only just starting to find. Before any of that steel could climb, the tower needed hands. Thousands of them, more than most cities would ever gather for a single building, drawn from villages you have likely never heard named, in states and provinces a very long way from the coastline where all of this was rising. If you had flown into the city in those years and looked down as the plane banked toward the airport, you might have noticed, tucked well beyond the glass and the marinas, a scatter of low dormitory blocks in the pale scrubland, row after row of them, roofs shimmering faintly in the heat. That was where the tower actually began each morning, long before the tower itself was anything more than a fenced pit and a promise. The men who filled those blocks had come mostly from India, from Pakistan, and from Bangladesh, recruited through agents in cities and district towns whose names never once appeared in the tower's own records. Some had worked construction before, on smaller buildings, ordinary ones, the kind that never make it into any story. Others had come from farms, from workshops, from trades that had nothing to do with concrete or steel, drawn by wages that sounded enormous back home and modest once converted and measured against the cost of living so far from it. You do not need to hold on to any of the arithmetic here, only the shape of the choice each of them made, weighing a wage against a distance, a family against a length of time away that none of them could really picture in advance. The camps themselves sat on the city's outer edge, in districts built for exactly this purpose, long straight streets of shared rooms, communal kitchens, prayer halls, small shops selling phone cards and tea. If you walked between the blocks in the hour before dawn, the air would already be moving. Men crossing the gravel yards with towels over their shoulders, queues forming outside washrooms, someone always shouting a name toward a window. The camps ran to their own private clock, one that had nothing to do with the office towers rising downtown, and everything to do with getting several thousand men fed, dressed, and onto buses before the sun had properly cleared the horizon. Breakfast was simple and came early. Flatbread, lentils, sometimes an egg, tea poured from urns big enough to have their own dents and histories. You could smell the kitchens from some distance before you reached them, that particular mix of wood smoke, spice, and diesel that clung to every labor camp in that part of the city. Men ate standing or crouched on their heels in the gravel, moving fast because the buses did not wait, and a missed bus meant a missed shift, and a missed shift meant a missed day's pay in a system that measured almost everything in exactly those terms. The buses themselves left in long convoys, headlights still on, winding out past the edge of the camps and onto roads that were mostly empty at that hour, save for other buses doing exactly the same journey from other camps toward the same rising shape on the skyline. If you had been sitting near the back of one of those buses, you would have felt the engine labor under the weight of everyone crowded aboard, seen the window glass fog faintly with breath in the cooler pre-dawn air, watched the city thin out into service roads and construction fencing long before the tower itself came into view. The ride could run close to an hour each way, twice a day, added quietly onto shifts that were already long, in heat that would already be building by mid-morning into something the body simply had to learn to work inside of, rather than fight. Wages varied by trade and by contractor, and the historical record on this point is not tidy. Pay scales differed between companies working the same site, and workers themselves have described in later interviews and inquiries wages that sometimes fell short of what had been promised before they ever left home. It is worth saying plainly and calmly that this is one of the more disputed and uncomfortable chapters in the tower's story, and no honest telling of it should smooth that over. Some men sent almost everything home, keeping barely enough for themselves. Others found the arrangement fair enough given what work was available in the places they had come from. The sources disagree on how common each experience was, and this account will not pretend to settle what the record itself does not settle. What is not disputed is the scale of what all of this fed into. On any given week during the years the tower climbed, the workforce assigned to the site ran into the thousands, organized into overlapping shifts so that work never fully stopped, only slowed and thickened at certain hours and thinned at others. If you stood at the perimeter fence in the middle of the afternoon, you would have seen almost no gap in the movement. Men crossing between stacks of rebar, cement trucks idling in line, cranes swinging steadily overhead. The whole yard behaving less like a single building site and more like a small, temporary working town that happened to be building something enormous at its center. And there, somewhere inside that moving crowd, you would have found the young rigger again, one face among thousands. And yet, if this story has any right to follow one thread through all of that scale, it is his. But what did a single day actually look like for one man among so many, once the buses had emptied and the gates had opened and the whole enormous machine of the site swallowed him back into its rhythm? The rigger had been on site since the earliest days of the foundation, one of the many whose names the surviving records never troubled to keep. And by the time the first floors began to rise, he had already spent enough seasons on the project that the site no longer frightened him the way it once had. He carried his own gloves, worn pale at the palms, and a coil of light rope slung across one shoulder that he kept even when it was not strictly needed, because a rigger without his rope on him felt, he might have said, like a man without his own hands. His hard hat had a scuff on one side from an early fall he never spoke about, and his boots had been resoled twice by a cobbler near the camp who did steady business fixing exactly this kind of boot for exactly this kind of man. His mornings began the same way as everyone else's. The queue for the washroom, the flatbread eaten standing, the long bus ride with his head against the window glass, watching the camp lights fall away behind him and the tower's crane lights slowly rise ahead to take their place. By the time he reached the site, the sky would still be more grey than blue, and the concrete already poured the day before would still be sweating faintly in the cooling night air, giving off a smell he had come to know the way other men know the smell of their own kitchens. He would check his harness, check it again out of habit rather than doubt, and begin the climb. The climb itself was not glamorous, whatever the finished tower would later look like from the ground. It meant ladders bolted to the rising core, temporary stairs that swayed faintly underfoot, hoists that carried men up in stages between floors, still open to the sky at their edges. If you had gone up with him on an ordinary morning, you would have felt the air change as you climbed, cooler then hotter again as the sun cleared the horizon and struck the exposed concrete, the wind picking up in gusts that had nothing to stop them once you passed a certain height, tugging at loose ties and stray sheeting with a sound like something breathing. He worked with two others most days, men he had known since the early months on the project, and between them they had developed a shorthand of gestures for use in the wind when shouted words simply blew away before they reached anyone's ears. There is a small detail from camp life that seems worth keeping, one of the kind that never makes it into any official summary of the project, and yet says more about the texture of those years than most of the official summaries manage. In the evenings, after the buses had returned and the men had washed the day's dust from their arms, groups would gather in the open space between the dormitory blocks to watch cricket matches on a single television carried out on an extension cord, the volume turned up loud enough to reach the back rows of men sitting on overturned crates and coils of rope borrowed unofficially from the very site they had just left. It cost nothing, and it asked nothing of anyone beyond showing up, and for an hour or two each evening it turned several thousand men a very long way from home into something closer to neighbors than strangers who happened to share a bus route. If your eyes are already closed by this point, that is exactly the right way to be carried through the rest of it. None of this asks to be remembered in any detail, only felt, the way the men themselves must have felt those evenings pass. By the time the tower's lowest floors were ready to rise clear of the foundation, the site had reached something close to its full strength. Every trade represented, every shift filled, the camps beyond the city running at a capacity that would have seemed unthinkable to whoever first sketched the tower's outline on paper. Concrete gangs, rebar teams, riggers, crane operators, electricians laying cable that had not yet found anything to power, all of them moving through the same fenced acres in careful overlapping waves, timed so that no two crews were ever quite standing in the same place at the same moment. The rigger climbed a little higher each week now, following the concrete as it found its footing floor by floor, and if you had watched him from the ground in those early weeks of the rise, he would have looked like nothing more than a small dark shape against the pale new concrete, one of thousands of small dark shapes doing exactly the same patient work all across the site. What rose beneath him, floor by floor, was still only the beginning of something that would eventually leave every other building in the city looking low and ordinary by comparison. But that shape and the rhythm by which it climbed is a story that belongs properly to what comes next. The rhythm that carried the tower upward did not begin with concrete at all. It began with steel, with a system of formwork that could climb on its own, floor after floor, without ever touching the ground again once it had left it. If you had stood on one of the lower levels in those first months and looked straight up, you would have seen it. A ring of steel platforms and hydraulic legs wrapped around the rising core, looking almost like scaffolding until you noticed that nothing about it was being lowered back down. It went up and it stayed up, lifting itself on its own jacks to the next level once the concrete below it had taken enough strength to bear its own weight. There is a quiet cleverness in that idea that still catches in the throat of anyone who has spent time on a site watching cranes labor over dead weight. A formwork system that does not need to be craned anywhere at all, that simply climbs the building it is helping to build. You do not need to understand the hydraulics to feel the logic of it. Think of a caterpillar drawing its back half up to meet its front, then reaching forward again. Except here, the reaching forward is a floor of finished concrete, curing quietly in the desert air, while the platform above it prepares the next one. The system had been used before on other towers in other cities, but never on a shape quite like this one, and never asked to keep climbing for quite as long. Every time it rose, it carried with it the working deck, the safety railings, the small enclosed spaces where a crew could stand out of the wind for a few minutes, and the rails along which the concrete pumps and rebar could be fed up from below. It was, in effect, a small mobile factory floor perched at the top of the tallest thing for miles in any direction, moving upward one story at a time and taking its whole world of tools and materials with it. What that system made possible once the crews had learned its habits was a pace that still gets spoken of quietly among engineers, the way old sailors speak of a fast crossing. At its peak, the tower rose by one full floor roughly every 3 days. Say that slowly and it can sound almost gentle. 3 days, one floor, but stretch it out over the shape of an actual working week, and you begin to feel what it demanded. There was no floor that was allowed to be a resting point. The moment one level's concrete had cured enough to carry the climbing formwork's weight, the whole apparatus lifted itself into position for the next, and the cycle began again. Rebar cages swung into place, formwork panels closed around them, concrete pumped up through pipes that ran the height of the building so far that engineers had to solve, almost as a side project, the separate problem of how to keep wet concrete moving at all once it had climbed that high without the pressure or the heat ruining it on the way. 3 days does not leave room for delay. It does not leave room for a crew that is tired or a delivery that is late or weather that turns against the poor. And yet, month after month, that was the pace the site held to. And holding to it meant that hundreds of people were, at any given hour, moving through a version of the same sequence they had moved through the day before, and would move through again the day after. If you close your eyes and imagine that climbing platform at 2 or 3 in the morning, you are not imagining an empty site. You are imagining lights strung along steel railings and the low grind of a concrete pump somewhere below, and men and women in hard hats and reflective vests moving along walkways that had not existed a week before and would be replaced by newer ones within days. There is nothing you need to hold on to here, no name or number worth keeping, only the feeling of a place that never really stopped, shift folding into shift, the work simply continuing while the rest of the city slept beneath it. The tower's shape made that choreography more intricate than it would have been on a simpler building. Because it rose not as a single square stack, but as 3 wings spreading from a central core, each wing reaching a different height before it stopped and became simply roof. The crews were never pouring one uniform ring of concrete. They were pouring three related but distinct sections in careful sequence, staggering the work so that one wing's rebar cage was being tied into place while another wing's concrete was being poured, and a third wing's most recent pour was curing quietly under the desert night, gaining the strength it would need to carry the climbing rig's next lift. It meant the same crew of engineers walking the site at any hour might see all three stages happening within a few dozen meters of each other, the wings slightly offset from one another in height so that the building, if you had watched it from a helicopter, would have looked faintly like a staircase folding itself upward into three separate points. That offsetting was not an accident of scheduling. It let the crews move steadily from one wing to the next without ever standing idle, waiting for concrete to cure before there was somewhere else useful to put their hands. But keeping three wings moving at once, each on its own rhythm of steel and pour and cure, still leaves open the question that matters most to anyone who has ever watched something very tall going up in a hurry. How do you keep something rising that fast, day after day, from beginning to lean? That question belonged, more than to anyone else on the site, to the tower's structural engineer, Bill Baker, the same man whose quiet insistence on the tower's Y-shaped footprint had shaped everything that came after it. By the time the climbing formwork had found its rhythm, Baker's part of the work had shifted from the drawing board to something closer to a physician's rounds, walking the tower, in effect, even when he was not physically walking it, through the instruments that reported back its condition from hundreds of meters up. Surveyors on site used precise optical instruments and satellite positioning to check, floor by floor, that the building's true position in space still matched the position it was supposed to hold on the drawings. The tolerances they were working to were not measured in centimeters, they were measured in millimeters, spread out over a height that by this stage in the build was already taller than anything else you could see from the site in any direction, and a deviation that would have been meaningless on a small building became, at that scale, something that needed to be caught early and corrected quietly before it could grow. Concrete, it turns out, has its own quiet betrayals when the sun gets involved. A tower rising in a desert does not heat evenly. One face can sit in direct sun for hours, while the opposite face remains in shade, and the warmed concrete expands by a fraction that no eye could ever detect, while the cooler side does not. Multiply that fraction by the height of a building still climbing toward record altitude, and the tower can begin to lean, ever so slightly, toward whichever side has spent the day in shadow, leaning back the other way again once the sun moves on. Baker's team watched for exactly that kind of drift, checking the tower's verticality against its theoretical centerline again and again as it rose, and where the readings showed the beginnings of an error, the correction was folded quietly into the next few floors of formwork positioning, nudging the climb back onto its true line before the discrepancy could compound itself into something visible. It is close, careful work, the kind that never announces itself to anyone standing on the ground looking up. And if you have ever wondered why a very tall building manages to look from any angle as though it is standing perfectly straight, the answer is usually a version of this, someone checking and rechecking long before the eye could ever catch a fault. Among the thousands of small, dark shapes still moving across that climbing platform, the young rigger from the early weeks of the pour was, by this point in the build, no longer quite so unfamiliar with the height beneath his boots. He had been one of hundreds whose names no surviving record kept, the men and women who tied rebar, guided concrete hoses, and checked formwork bolts through shift after shift as the building outgrew, one 3-day cycle at a time, every structure that had ever stood near it. He would have felt, more than seen, the platform's small shudder each time its hydraulic legs lifted it to the next level, a movement so routine to him by then that it likely barely registered, the way a sound stops registering once you have heard it every night for months. If your eyes are already closing, that feeling is not a bad one to carry into sleep. The sense of something enormous being carried upward calmly, in small, controlled movements by people who had stopped finding it remarkable and simply kept working. From the ground, by the time this rhythm had held for the better part of a year, the tower no longer looked like a construction site with an unusual amount of scaffolding. It looked like something that had already rearranged the city's sense of its own skyline, a pale, vertical presence visible from neighborhoods that had never had anything to measure their evening light against before. Drivers on the highway found themselves glancing toward it without quite meaning to. Photographs taken from rooftops across the city began to include it whether or not it had been the subject of the photograph at all. And yet, for all that dominance, for all the ways it had already made every other building nearby look low and temporary by comparison, the tower climbing on its 3-day rhythm was still, at this point, far short of the height it was ultimately built to reach, which meant that the machines lifting concrete and men and steel up through its rising core were about to be asked for something even harder than what they had already given, as the desert sun and the sheer distance from the ground began to test the limits of what any of it could bear. You would have felt the change before anyone told you about it. Lower on the tower, the heat was simply weather, something to work inside, to schedule around, to break for at midday and return to once the worst of it had passed. Higher up, it became something else. The air did not cool the way you might expect as the ground fell away beneath you. It thinned, and the wind that had barely stirred the flags on the perimeter fence began, 600 feet up, to lean on scaffolding and worry loose ends of rope in a way it never had before. If you had climbed with the crews that season, you would have noticed your own breathing change before you noticed the view. The city below had already gone flat and pale, a map of roads and rooftops with the sea a thin grey line at its edge, and none of it mattered as much up there as the simple question of how anything, water, steel, a bag of tools, a human body, was going to get from the ground to where the work now was. That question, more than any other, is what the tower's climb had turned into by this stage. Every floor gained was a floor further from the trucks and the yard, and the supply of ordinary things a construction site depends on, and the systems built to solve that problem were themselves becoming part of the story. Hoists ran on tracks bolted to the outside of the rising core, climbing with the building rather than being rebuilt at every stage, carrying crews up in cars that swayed faintly in the wind the way a lift shaft never does at ground level. Materials that could not go up by hoist, the wet concrete above all, had to travel a different way entirely, and it is here that the story turns toward the machines that were, by this point in the build, doing something no pump anywhere had done before. You do not usually think of concrete as something with a maximum height. It is heavy, wet, unglamorous stuff, mixed by the truckload and poured into forms with none of the drama that steel and glass get credit for. But concrete has a memory of its own gravity. Pump it too far upward and it begins, ounce by ounce, to fight the pressure meant to carry it, and if it sets even slightly before it arrives, the pipe carrying it becomes a plug rather than a channel. The tower's concrete, on the days the crews were pouring the core near its then-current top, was being pushed higher than any pump on any building site had previously managed to send it, a fact the engineers on the project treated less as a triumph to announce and more as a problem still needing daily solving. What that solving looked like, if you had stood at the base of one of those pump lines on a hot morning, was less spectacle than patience. The pipes themselves were reinforced and insulated, wrapped against a sun that could otherwise heat the metal enough to start cooking the mix inside it before it had gone anywhere. The concrete itself had been engineered for exactly this fight. Chemical retarders slowing the setting time so the mix would still be liquid enough to flow when it reached the top. And on the hottest pours, ice was mixed directly into the batch at the plant, chilling it down before it ever left the ground so that the desert would not win the argument before the concrete had even started its climb. You would have heard the pump itself as a low mechanical pulse somewhere behind you, felt through the ground more than through the air, the sound of something working harder than it had ever been asked to work before, and so far still winning. Timing mattered as much as chemistry. Pours at that height were increasingly pushed into the hours after dark, when the desert gave back some of the heat it had spent all day taking in, and the pipes were less likely to cook the mix inside them before it reached the forms. If you had been on site at 2 in the morning during one of those pours, you would have found the place almost gentle. Floodlights instead of sun, the temperature down from something punishing to something merely warm, and a crew moving through a rhythm they had done so many times by now that it barely needed instruction. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of this, no valve or additive you have to remember, only the shape of the problem and the shape of the answer, a machine straining upward past every precedent it had, and a set of quiet, unglamorous adjustments. Insulation, ice, darkness, patience that let it keep going anyway. But pushing wet concrete upward through a pipe is one kind of difficulty, and it is not the one that leaves marks on people. What was it actually like to be one of the men standing on the steel above where that concrete would eventually arrive, with the wind doing things at that height it had never done to them on the ground? The wind was the first thing anyone at that elevation would tell you about if pressed, though most did not talk about it much because talking about it did no good. Lower down, a strong gust was an inconvenience, something that rattled loose sheeting and made a foreman shout a little louder. Well above the halfway mark of the tower's eventual height, the same gust arrived with enough force to make a full-grown man lean into it just to hold his footing, and it did not always announce itself before it hit. You would have felt it first as a pressure against one side of your body, then as a sound, not a howl so much as a steady, toneless push against every taut line and loose sheet of ply on the platform around you. And you would have understood, the way anyone does eventually, why every crew working that high wore a harness clipped to something solid before they did anything else at all. The heat did not disappear at that height either, though it changed its character. There was less of the thick, ground-level closeness to it, replaced by a drier, more searching kind of warmth that came as much from the concrete and steel underfoot as from the sun itself. A slab poured the night before, still giving back heat by mid-morning, a length of rebar too hot to hold bare-handed by early afternoon. Rest breaks were written into the schedule the way meals were, not as a courtesy, but as a safety requirement, because a body pushed too far in that combination of altitude, wind, and heat begins to fail in ways that are easy to miss until they are serious. Water points were placed at intervals up through the rising structure so that no one had to choose between finishing a task and getting a drink, and shaded rest areas climbed with the building the same way the hoists did, moving upward as the work moved upward, because sending an exhausted man all the way back down to find shade was its own kind of danger. It is worth remembering, if your eyes have already begun to close, that none of this required you to imagine anything you have not already felt in some smaller form. The particular tiredness of heat, the way wind changes your balance, the relief of shade after too long without it. The tower simply asked those ordinary human limits to hold at a scale and a height where the old margins no longer applied. And the answer to that was not heroics, but structure. Harnesses, netting, rest schedules, water points, nets strung below working platforms to catch what should never be allowed to fall as far as it otherwise would. Among the men working that high by this stage of the build was the same young rigger who had climbed with the tower from very near its beginning, one of the many whose names the record never kept, but whose kind of work it remembers clearly enough. He had started on levels where a dropped tool fell perhaps 2 or 3 stories onto a floor deck below, and someone shouted a warning, and that was the end of it. Now the same mistake sent something falling past hundreds of feet of open air before it had any chance of landing safely, which is why every tool by this stage was tethered to its user by a short lanyard, clipped and reclipped 100 times a day without complaint, because the alternative was a strip of empty air with nothing in it to stop what had been dropped. He would have told you, if you had asked him plainly, that the wind was the thing he never got used to, not the height itself, not the distance to the ground, but the way a gust could arrive from nowhere and lean the whole platform under his boots for a second before letting go again. By the time the tower approached the milestone height that would soon put it beyond every building that had ever stood before it anywhere on Earth, word of what that height was costing the people raising it had begun to travel further than the site itself, into newspapers, into reports from labor groups and diplomats, into questions asked in places far from the desert about the wages, the hours, and the conditions of the workforce climbing with the tower every 3 days. That attention did not arrive all at once, and it did not slow the pace of the pause or the climb of the hoists. But it had started, quietly, the way most scrutiny of a project like this one starts, as a question asked from outside, about a kind of work that, from the ground, still looked from a distance like nothing more than a thin line of steel rising calmly into a bright and empty sky. What those questions asked, mostly, was simple enough to state plainly: who was being paid what, and whether the answer matched what the work actually demanded of a body at that height. The company managing the site began, around this stage, to publish its own figures on wages and housing in response, numbers that satisfied some of the people asking and did nothing at all for others, and the gap between those two reactions became its own quiet feature of the project's final years. None of it reached the platforms where the rigger and men like him were still clipping tools to lanyards and leaning into wind that had no interest in newspapers. Up there, the questions that mattered were narrower and more immediate: whether the next pour would hold its slump in the heat, whether the hoist car would arrive on schedule, whether the harness clip had been checked twice rather than once. It is to that daily, unglamorous arithmetic of survival and progress that the record itself now turns, in the reports and inspections that would later try to reconstruct exactly how all of this had actually been done. Those reports did not arrive all at once, and they did not agree with each other in every particular, which is itself a kind of honesty rarely found in accounts of a single building. Newspapers in one country described conditions in one register, human rights organizations in another, and the company overseeing construction in a third, and if you set the three side by side on a table in front of you, you would find yourself in the position of every honest chronicler of a large undertaking, certain that something real had happened, and less certain of its exact shape. What is not in dispute is that the workforce raising the tower was made up overwhelmingly of men who had traveled a long way to be there from South Asian countries, drawn by wages that looked substantial when converted and quoted before they ever boarded the flight, and that many of them had paid recruitment agents in their home countries a sum before they left, sometimes borrowed, sometimes the savings of a whole extended family, in exchange for the promise of the job at all. This part of the arrangement predated the tower by decades and was not unique to it, but the scale of the project meant that whatever was true of construction labor generally in that region was, on this site, magnified and made visible to an audience that had not been paying close attention before. You would have felt none of this on the higher decks, where the wind and the poor schedule occupied every waking hour, but down at the level of the camps and the recruitment offices, the arrangement produced a particular kind of vulnerability. A worker who had borrowed against a debt to get the job could not easily walk away from a wage dispute, because walking away meant returning home still owing the debt and having nothing to show for the time spent earning against it. Reports from advocacy groups working the region in the middle years of the project, most notably a widely read study published by Human Rights Watch that examined conditions across a number of Dubai construction sites, this one prominent among them, described exactly this bind. Passports held by employers rather than by the men who owned them, wages paid weeks late or partially, and a legal structure that made it difficult for a foreign worker to change employer even where conditions were plainly bad. The company managing the site disputed elements of these accounts at the time, and it is worth saying plainly, in the spirit of an honest record, that the picture was not uniform. Some subcontractors on the project paid on schedule and housed their crews reasonably, others did not, and the tower's scale meant dozens of subcontracting firms were involved across its life, each with its own practices, its own foreman, its own reputation among the men who worked under them. If you had walked the length of one camp and then another, you might have found the food better in one, the beds more crowded in the next, the wait for wages shorter in a third. The project was not one employer but a web of them, and the record reflects that unevenness rather than a single simple verdict. It was into this unevenness that the protest fell, in the year the tower was still climbing through its middle floors. Workers on site, frustrated by unpaid wages and by transportation arrangements that left long hours unpaid at either end of a shift, stopped work and, according to the news accounts of the day, damaged vehicles and site equipment before order was restored, and a number of the men involved were later returned to their home countries. Different outlets described the scale of it differently. Some spoke of a few hundred participants, others of a great deal more, and no official tally exists that reconciles every account into a single number you could read out with confidence. What is clear is that for a day, the ordinary rhythm of the site, the 3-day climb, the pour, the strike of the forms, stopped, and that this stoppage was reported far beyond the country in which it happened, in a way that put a spotlight on the tower's foundations in an entirely different sense than the one this story has already spent time on. You do not need to hold every figure from that period in your memory to understand the shape of it, and if some of this is already softening into the dark behind your eyes, that is exactly the right way to receive it, not as an indictment to carry forward, but as a fact laid gently alongside the others, the way a good record ought to be read at any hour, awake or otherwise. But once the reports and the newspapers and the company's own statements are set side by side, what does the record actually show, and where does it stop showing anything at all? On wages, the picture is reasonably clear. The base pay for an unskilled laborer on the site, by most accounts from the period, sat somewhere in the range of a few hundred dirhams a month, a sum that, converted, looked small by the standards of the wealthier countries watching the tower rise, but was not small measured against wages for equivalent work in the laborer's home region, which is part of why men kept arriving despite everything already known about the arrangement by the time they signed. On working hours, the record shows a country whose labor law already mandated a midday break during the hottest months, a rule that predated the tower and applied across the industry, though enforcement varied by site and by season, and was itself the subject of periodic complaint. On the death toll specifically attributable to the tower's construction, the record is the thinnest and most contested part of the whole account. The company overseeing the project stated, at various points, that the site's safety record compared favorably to similar projects internationally, citing a low number of fatalities directly connected to construction activity, while journalists and advocacy researchers argued that the true figure was undercounted, pointing to deaths from heat-related illness, from accidents on the roads to and from camps, and from causes recorded administratively in ways that removed them from the tally of construction deaths, even though they were plainly connected to the work and its conditions. Neither side's figure has been independently verified to the satisfaction of the other, and this account will not pretend to settle a dispute that better resourced investigations than this one have not settled either. What can be said without controversy is that scrutiny of the project's labor practices increased steadily as the tower rose, that this scrutiny came from multiple directions at once: journalists, unions, diplomatic missions of the workers' home countries, and eventually buyers and investors concerned about the reputational weight of the building they were purchasing space in. And that this pressure did not simply dissipate into argument. It produced changes on the ground, which is where this part of the story is headed next, and where the rigger you have already spent some hours with on this scaffold has something to add. He was not among the men who stopped work that day. His crew, riding hoists between the upper floors, heard about it the way most of the tower heard about it, second-hand, filtered through the foreman's brief account at the start of the next shift, delivered in the same flat tone used for weather and for the day's target floor. But he had lived in the camps long enough by then, and moved between enough different subcontractors as the tower's needs shifted to have formed his own private sense of which crews were treated well and which were not. And if you had asked him, though no one thought to interview a rigger for the newspapers, he would likely have told you what the record from other, less prominent workers on other sites already tells us, that the difference between a fair site and an unfair one was not abstract, and could usually be read in small things. Whether the water truck came on time, whether the wage slip matched the hours worked, whether a man who fell ill could see a doctor without losing a week's pay for missing the shift. He is one of many such men whose individual testimony was never recorded and cannot now be reconstructed, and it would be dishonest of this account to give him words he never spoke or a grievance he may never have raised. What can honestly be said is that men in his position, foreign laborers on long contracts, several rungs up from the newest arrivals but still far from anything resembling security, were the ones for whom the reforms that followed the scrutiny actually mattered, in ways that a man watching from a hotel balcony across the city, admiring the tower's climb, would never have reason to notice. Those reforms arrived gradually rather than all at once, and none of them were unique to this single project. They were changes to the wider regulatory environment in which the tower happened to be the most visible example. A wage protection system was introduced requiring employers to pay salaries electronically into verified accounts on a fixed schedule, closing off the easiest way wages had previously gone missing or arrived late without any paper trail to prove it. Restrictions on the practice of confiscating passports were formalized, though enforcement remained uneven for years afterward, as enforcement of labor regulation across large migrant workforces generally does. Some recruitment fee practices were addressed by agreements between sending and receiving countries, an attempt to interrupt the debt bondage dynamic at its origin rather than only at its destination. None of these measures undid what had already happened to the men who left the project before the reforms arrived, and no account of this period should pretend that a policy adopted midway through a build repairs the years before it. But the record does show a site and an industry around it that looked different at the tower's topping out than it had at its groundbreaking, not resolved, not without ongoing criticism in the years since, but altered in ways that later projects in the same city were built under. If you are still awake for this part, you do not need to weigh every side of it tonight, or decide for yourself where the true count lies. That work belongs to daylight, and to people with subpoena power and translators and years to spend on it, not to a bedtime accounting of a tower half a mile into the sky. What matters for the thread this story is following is simpler, that the men clipping their lanyards to the highest railings, riding the hoists up through clouds some mornings before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, were doing so inside a set of arrangements that were, by the tower's final years, somewhat different, somewhat more accountable, somewhat less easily abused than the arrangements the project had started with. Whether that was enough, history and the workers themselves are still the ones best positioned to judge. And so the record, having said what it can honestly say and left open what it cannot, returns you to where it left you a little while ago, to the platforms still climbing, floor by floor, toward a height that had by now outstripped every tower built before it on any continent. The wage disputes and the reports and the policy changes were happening in offices and in camps at ground level, but above them, entirely unbothered by any of it in the moment-to-moment sense, the work went on, because the work always went on, 3 days at a time, 1 floor at a time, climbing now toward the section of the building where the ordinary rules of pouring concrete and placing steel would begin to run out, and something more delicate, a needle, a spire, a final reach toward a point that existed at this stage only on a drafting table, would have to be built instead. The tower had been narrowing for a long while by now, though narrowing is almost too gentle a word for what was happening to it, floor by floor, up where the crews were working. Each of the 3 wings that had defined its plan from the very lowest levels was drawing in on itself, setbacks stacking on setbacks, so that if you had been able to stand back far enough to see the whole building at once, and almost nowhere in the city gave you that view any longer, the tower having long since climbed past anything that could measure it, you would have watched the plan quietly lose one wing, then another, the Y shape that had organized every floor beneath slowly folding into something simpler until only a single core remained, rising alone into the haze. There is nothing you need to hold on to in that image if it is already slipping past you. It is enough to know that a building which began as 3 arms reaching outward from a center had spent its whole climb bringing those arms back together, and that by this point in the work, the bringing together was almost done. What was left, above the last inhabited floor, was not really a floor at all in the way the rest of the tower had been floors. It was a spire, a tapering hollow steel needle that would carry no offices, no apartments, no mechanical plant, nothing but itself and the wind moving through it. And it would still need to be built with the same patience as everything below it, because height without structure is only an idea, and this tower had never been interested in ideas that could not be built. The spire had been designed, like nearly everything else about the building, on paper long before the ground had even been surveyed, but paper spires do not have to resist anything, and this one would have to stand in wind loads that grew stranger and less forgiving the higher you went, thinning air pulling at a shape with almost none of the mass of the structure beneath it to steady it. You would have needed to look almost straight up to see where the concrete stopped and the steel began, because the transition was not dramatic from the ground, no seam, no visible joint, just a narrowing column continuing on past the point where you might have expected it to stop. What was happening up there, out of sight of anyone at street level, was that sections of the spire were being assembled in pieces far too heavy and far too awkward to be lifted whole, and were being hoisted instead the way nearly every other heavy element of this building had been hoisted, piece by piece, welded and bolted into place, checked, and then left to become the platform for the piece above it. A crane sat at the very top of the working structure for this purpose, a smaller and more specialized rig than the tower cranes that had carried concrete buckets and rebar cages for years by this point, built specifically to climb inside the spire itself as the spire rose, walking upward on its own frame the way the building's main climbing formwork had walked upward on the floors below, so that the machine doing the lifting was never far below the point it was lifting toward. If you try to picture what that would have felt like to stand near, it helps to remember there was almost nothing left to stand on. The wide floor plates of the offices and hotel levels were gone by now. What the crews had instead, at this elevation, was a narrow working platform wrapped around a lattice of steel that was itself only a fraction of the width of the building far below. Wind that would have been a minor nuisance 800 meters lower reached up here as something you had to plan around, something that could halt a lift entirely on an otherwise clear day, because a piece of steel swinging on a cable becomes a very different problem when the air moving it is moving harder than anyone can predict from the ground. But how do you lift a spire that must, by definition, go higher than any crane sitting beneath it can ever reach? The answer the engineers arrived at was patient, rather than clever in the flashy sense, though there is a kind of cleverness in patience too. The crane did not try to outclimb the spire. Instead, sections were lifted from inside the spire's own rising body, hoisted through the structure that was already built, so that the tower was, in effect, building its own scaffolding for its own final push, and then discarding that scaffolding piece by piece as it went. Once a segment was welded and bolted into place, and the connections checked against the tolerances that had governed every other joint in the building, the crane would climb again, resting on the very steel it had just helped raise and reach for the next segment waiting below. It is a strange thing to sit with, if you let yourself picture it slowly in the dark. A machine climbing a ladder it is building underneath itself as it goes, one rung disappearing into the last just as the next one is set. The riggers who did this work were, by this point in the project, not new to height. Many of them had been with the tower long enough that the lower floors, the ones that had once seemed impossibly high to reach, were now simply the ground they had left behind them years before. One rigger who had come up through the ironworking crews earlier in the climb, one of the many whose names the record never kept, but whose trade the record remembers clearly. Men who had learned to walk steel in wind that would have flattened someone new to the work, was, according to the accounts that survived from those final months, still working at the summit cruise by the time the spire itself was going up, having spent the better part of the tower's rise moving upward at roughly the same pace as the building itself, floor by floor, season by season. He would not have thought of it as a career built inside a single structure. It would simply have been where the work was, and the work by then was very near the top of the world as anyone standing in that desert had ever known it. This was where the tower's climb finally stopped being a story about concrete, because concrete, by its nature, needs enough width and enough load beneath it to make sense, and up here there was neither. Steel could taper in a way concrete could not, could be shaped into a needle rather than a shaft, could be light enough that a crane sitting on top of 800 meters of finished structure could still lift it without asking that structure to do more than it was built for. Every material on this project had been chosen for a reason specific to the problem in front of it, and the spire's reason was simple. At this height, in this wind, carrying nothing but its own weight and the ambition of the building beneath it, steel was the only sensible answer. Adrian Smith had drawn this shape years before any of it left the ground, sketching a silhouette that tapered the way certain desert flowers taper, narrowing toward a single point the way a minaret narrows, because he had wanted the building to end in something that looked inevitable rather than added on. Not a tower with an antenna stuck to its roof, but a tower that simply kept becoming more slender until it became a line, and then became sky. Bill Baker's task, as it had been at every stage before this one, was to make sure that inevitability could actually stand up. The two men had spent years working out how a building could narrow this much and still resist the forces trying to push it sideways, and the spire was the last and thinnest test of that partnership. The place where the architecture Smith had imagined and the structure Baker had calculated finally had nowhere left to hide from each other, because there was so little material left to share the load between them. If the design failed anywhere, it would fail here at the top, where the margins were smallest and the wind was least forgiving. It did not fail. Segment by segment, the needle they had drawn together on paper years earlier kept becoming the needle standing in the desert air, and by the later stages of this work, there was very little left to add before the drawing and the building would finally match each other exactly. The day the final segment was lifted into place and welded home was not marked in the accounts that survive by anything as loud as a ceremony. There was no crowd at that height to see it happen, no possibility of one. The only witnesses were the riggers who had raised it, and the engineers checking the connection against the same exacting tolerances that had governed every joint below. What happened instead was quieter and, in its way, more complete. The crane that had climbed the spire segment by segment had nowhere left to climb. The building had reached the elevation that had existed until that point only as a number on a drawing prepared years earlier in an office far from any desert, by two men who had never fully known, until this moment, whether the sky they were reaching for would actually hold still long enough to let them touch it. It did. If you have already let your eyes close somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right place to have stopped following the words, because nothing that happens at a topping out needs to be remembered in detail to be understood. A building simply stops climbing, and for the first time since the ground was broken, there is no next floor waiting above the last one. What followed the topping out was not celebration so much as a change in the nature of the work itself, because a tower that has reached its full height is still, in every meaningful sense, unfinished. The concrete and steel had done what concrete and steel do, which is stand. What remained was to give the standing structure a skin, a set of finishes, mechanical systems, glass, the 1,000 smaller trades that turn a frame into a place someone can actually live or work inside. Crews that had spent years chasing the climbing formwork upward now turned their attention back downward, beginning the long, patient work of finishing floors that had been structurally complete for months or years by the time anyone came back to close them in. A different rhythm entirely from the 3-day cycles that had defined the climb, slower in some ways, more intricate in others, and every bit as demanding of the workers who would spend the coming months moving through a building that had already, in the most literal sense, reached the sky above them. You would have known the cladding was coming before you ever saw a panel go up, because the tower had already begun to change color at its base long before the work reached anywhere near the top. Aluminum and glass arrived at the site in crates that themselves had to be sequenced with the same discipline as the concrete pours, each panel numbered, each destined for one particular place on a surface that curved and narrowed as it rose, so that no two panels, in truth, were ever quite the same. If you had walked the yard where they were staged before installation, you would have seen them laid out like the pages of some enormous book nobody could read all at once, silver and pale blue, waiting their turn to be lifted into a sky that had, by this stage of the project, become a permanent fixture of work, rather than a distant ambition. The scale of it is difficult to hold in the mind gently, so it helps to think of it the way the workers themselves must have thought of it, not as a single figure, but as floor after floor, each one its own small campaign. Across the whole height of the building, the finished skin would eventually cover an area you could measure in the hundreds of thousands of square meters. Though no one on site ever spoke in those terms, they spoke in floors, in elevations, in how many panels a rig could set before the wind picked up. There is nothing you need to hold on to in that number. What matters is only this: that a wrapping large enough to cover a small town had to be fitted, piece by piece, to a shape that was still, in its way, a living thing, expanding in the heat of the afternoon and drawing in again after dark. Fixing that skin required machines built for the purpose, because nothing off the shelf could do what this tower demanded. Specialized rigs, some of them cradle-like platforms suspended from the building's own crown, Others climbing frames that crept upward on rails bolted to the completed floors, carried crews and panels together into elevations where the ordinary language of construction, scaffolding, ladders, hoists, no longer quite applied. You would have felt the rig sway gently under you if you had stood on one of those platforms, not violently, but with a slow, rolling patience that mirrored the building's own quiet movement in the wind. And you would have understood, standing there, why every panel had to be checked and rechecked before it was allowed to leave the rig and take its place in the wall. The precision the work demanded is easiest to picture as a kind of quiet stubbornness. Because the tower tapered as it climbed, curving inward in stages, no panel could be treated as identical to its neighbor, even when the two looked the same from the ground. Each had to be aligned not just to the floor beneath it, but to the entire curve of the surface around it, a fraction of an inch of error compounding floor after floor into something that would have shown as a visible flaw from a mile away. Surveyors worked alongside the riggers with instruments trained on fixed points far below, calling out corrections in a language that had grown, by this stage of the project, into its own private dialect of numbers and small adjustments. If your eyes have already grown heavy, none of that arithmetic needs to follow you into sleep, only the picture of it, hands steadying a sheet of glass a quarter of a mile above the ground until it sat exactly where the drawing said it should. The material itself had been chosen with the same patience that had gone into every other decision on this job. The glass carried a coating meant to turn away much of the desert's heat before it ever reached the rooms behind it, and the aluminum fins between panels were shaped and angled to shade the glazing at certain hours without ever being asked to do so, simply by the geometry of their placement. None of it was ornamental in the way a passerby might assume, looking up from the street. Every reflective surface, every angled fin was doing quiet structural and thermal work, holding back a sun that could, in the wrong building, have turned upper floors into something closer to an oven than an office. You would not have known any of that standing at street level, dazzled by the shimmer of it. You would only have known that the tower, floor by floor, was beginning to look finished from below, even while its uppermost sections remained bare concrete, waiting their turn. But while the glass climbed toward the clouds one story at a time, what was happening far beneath it, in rooms that had stood finished in concrete for years by the time anyone returned to close them in? The answer is that the tower had begun in effect to be built twice, once upward in the long climb of formwork and cladding you have already followed, and once inward from both ends toward the middle, as crews who had never touched the climb at all began turning bare concrete floors into places a person might actually live or work. Lower floors, some of them finished structurally years earlier, were handed over to a different kind of worker altogether. Electricians running conduit through walls that had waited patiently in the dark for their arrival. Plasterers smoothing surfaces that had known nothing but raw concrete and desert dust. Glaziers fitting interior partitions long before the exterior skin above them had even reached that elevation. If you had ridden a construction hoist partway up the building during this period, you would have passed within the space of a few floors from finished rooms with soft lighting and marble underfoot, up through half-finished shells still smelling of fresh plaster into floors that were nothing yet but columns and slab, waiting their turn like empty stages between performances. This inward convergence was not an accident of scheduling so much as a deliberate strategy, born of necessity. A tower this tall could not wait for its entire height to be clad before anyone began fitting out its interior, not without adding years to a project that was already measured in the collective patience of thousands. So the work simply split in two directions and agreed to meet somewhere in the middle, lower floors handed to fit out crews almost as soon as the concrete had cured and the climbing rigs had moved safely past, while cladding crews kept working upward toward the summit at their own separate pace. It meant that for a long stretch of the project, the building existed in three states at once: finished and inhabited in its lower reaches, mid-transformation through its middle floors, and still raw, still climbing at its crown. There is a kind of peace in picturing that, if you let it settle, a structure quietly becoming itself from both directions, without any need for the listener to keep the details fixed in mind. Among the crews still working the upper faces of the tower during this stretch was the same young rigger who had once threaded steel through jumping formwork in the section of this story you may remember from earlier in the climb. One face among the many whose names the record never kept, but whose kind of work you can still picture clearly enough. By the time the cladding reached the higher floors, that rigger was several years further into the job, and the work itself had changed under his hands. There was no more racing 3-day cycles now, no more chasing the climb of formwork skyward before the concrete could set. The rhythm near the top had slowed into something closer to careful assembly, hours spent aligning a single panel rather than pouring an entire floor, and if he ever thought about how far the building had come since those early cycles below, the record does not say so. What the record does show is that men very much like him were still there at the very end of the exterior work, still riding the rigs at the tower's highest reaches, still setting panels into place against a sky that had, by then, become entirely ordinary to them. There would have come an afternoon, though no single date survives as the one that mattered, when the last panel was lifted into its place somewhere near the tower's crown, and the building's outer skin was, for the first time, complete from its buried foundations to its needle-like tip. You do not have to hold on to when that happened, only to what it meant. That the tower's true form, the shape architects and engineers had argued over years earlier, the tapering, spiraling silhouette meant to catch the desert light in a particular way, was now fully visible, for the first time, against the skyline it had spent years quietly rearranging. Seen from the ground, it would have looked at last like the drawings had always promised it would, glass and steel catching the sun in long vertical seams that ran the entire height of the structure, no longer a construction site wrapped in cranes, but a finished silhouette standing over a city that had, in the years since the first excavation, grown almost used to its presence. And yet, for all that the outer shell was finished, the tower's story was not, because a building this tall carries a second life inside its walls, one that would only begin once the last worker had climbed down and the first visitors were allowed, at last, to ride upward through all that finished glass and steel toward whatever waited for them at the top. What waited, in fact, was a set of tests no drawing could fully anticipate. Because a building that tall behaves in ways a shorter one simply never has to. The elevators alone demanded a kind of patience most passengers riding them today would never think to credit. Engineers ran the cars empty for weeks before anyone official was allowed aboard, watching cables that stretched for hundreds of meters settle and stretch again under their own weight, listening for any sound that might mean a shaft wall had shifted by some fraction no eye could catch. You would have heard those test runs from certain floors as a low hum rising and falling through the core of the building, patient and mechanical, like something breathing slowly in its sleep. Water had to be persuaded upward too, through a system of pumps staged at intervals rather than a single push from the ground, because no ordinary pump could send water half a mile against gravity in one continuous effort. Elevators, water, air, all of it tested separately, then together, then tested again, while outside the finished glass held its silence over a city still watching from below. And somewhere in the middle of all that quiet mechanical rehearsal, the tower still carried one more secret it had not yet shown anyone standing at street level. A name. It was a strange thing for a building to keep hidden, a name when it had already given up nearly every other secret it owned. Its foundations, its concrete, its steel, its glass, all measured and photographed and argued over for years by the time the water reached the last of its high tanks. And yet there it stood, half a mile of finished tower catching the low sun over the gulf, still going by a name that had never been meant to last, a name that had done its work the way scaffolding does its work, holding a shape in place until the real thing was ready to stand on its own. You would not have known it, looking up from the base of it in those final months. From where you stood, craning back until your neck ached, it was simply the tallest thing you had ever seen. A needle of glass rising out of a construction site that had somehow, without your quite noticing the moment it happened, stopped being a construction site and started being a landmark. But behind the glass, behind the closed elevators and the pressure-tested pipes, something else was happening that had nothing to do with concrete or wind loads at all. The world outside the fence line had begun to come apart, and the tower, for all its height, could not stand outside of that. But what was happening in the offices and the banks that had financed all this steel and glass, while the riggers and the pump operators went on with their quiet, unglamorous work 300 stories above the sand? Dubai had built itself, in the years the tower was rising, into something like a bet placed loudly and in public. Money had come in from everywhere, from oil wealth elsewhere in the region, from investors abroad, from banks eager to lend against a skyline that seemed to grow taller every year you looked at it. Cranes were not a rarity in that city. They were part of the horizon, dozens of them at a time, swinging over half-built towers and reclaimed islands and hotels shaped like sails. The tower you have been walking through in your mind for the length of this story was the tallest ambition of that decade, but it was never the only one. It rose alongside a whole city of ambitions, most of them financed the same way, with borrowed money, staked against the belief that property values would keep climbing the way the buildings themselves were climbing. For a long while, that belief held. Then, in the autumn before the tower's glass was finished, the belief broke somewhere else in the world first. In banks, in cities the tower would never see. Mortgages sold and resold until nobody quite knew what they were worth, until the not knowing itself became the crisis. You may remember, if you were old enough then, how quickly the language of that year changed. How words like credit and liquidity and confidence stopped sounding like banking terms and started sounding like weather. Something that could turn on you overnight. It reached Dubai the way weather reaches a coastline. Not all at once, but steadily, the tide simply failing to go back out the way it always had. Property prices in the city began to fall, and they did not fall gently. Towers that had sold on paper months earlier, sold again on paper before a single floor was poured, now sat half-finished with no one left to buy the rest of the floors. Some of the same construction camps you have already stood inside in this story. The same rows of bunks, the same long tables, the same men from the camps beyond the city eating dinner in shifts because the kitchens could not seat everyone at once, began to empty out on other sites nearby, work simply stopping mid-span, cranes left standing over concrete that would not be finished for years, if ever. It was not unusual in that season to drive past a building that looked from a distance almost exactly like the one you have been climbing in your mind through 11 sections of this story, except that it had stopped and would stay stopped. The tower did not stop. That is worth sitting with for a moment, in the dark, because it very nearly could have. The company behind it, the government-linked developer that had staked its name on the project from the very beginning, was carrying debt on a scale that made headlines of its own that winter, debt that, for a handful of tense months, put a genuine question mark over whether the tallest building on Earth would open with fanfare or open quietly to cover a balance sheet, or not open at all in the way anyone had planned. You do not need to remember the names of the holding companies or the exact figures involved to feel the shape of that year. It is enough to know that somewhere above the site office, in rooms far from the pump trucks and the rigging crews, people were doing arithmetic that had very little to do with concrete strength and everything to do with survival. If you are already drifting as you listen to this, you do not need to hold on to any of the numbers from that year. Only the feeling of a very tall, very finished thing standing quietly over a city that was, for a while, unsure of its own footing. What kept the tower moving in the end was not architecture, and it was not engineering, though both of those things had done their part for years already. It was a decision made somewhere outside the drawings, a decision about money and about neighbors, because Dubai was not standing entirely alone in that crisis. It belonged to a federation, one of 7 emirates bound together, and the largest and wealthiest of the others was watching from close enough to reach out a hand. That is where the second secret comes in. The name the tower had carried since before its foundations were poured, a working name, almost a placeholder. The kind of name a project takes on simply because the paperwork has to call it something. Burj Dubai, it had been called for years, in every drawing and every press release and every conversation you might have overheard on a scaffold. The Tower of Dubai, plainly and proudly attached to the city that had dreamed it up. And why not? The ambition had been Dubai's ambition from the first sketch. The land was Dubai's land. The skyline it would dominate was Dubai's skyline. If you had asked the rigger 3 years into the job what he was building, that is the name he would have given you without pausing to think about it. Then, on the day the tower was formally opened, in a ceremony with fireworks climbing the very glass that had been fitted panel by panel in the section of this story before this one, the name changed in front of the crowd watching quietly and without warning to most of them. It became, from that evening onward, the Burj Khalifa, named for Khalifa bin Zayed Al Nahyan, the president of the United Arab Emirates and the ruler of Abu Dhabi, the neighboring emirate whose support had helped carry Dubai and its debts through the worst of that difficult year. It was, in its way, a very small gesture set against a very large building, a single new word swapped into a name that otherwise changed nothing about the structure itself, not a beam moved, not a pane of glass replaced. And yet everyone who understood what had happened in the months before that evening understood exactly what the new name was quietly saying, the way a bridge might be renamed for whoever paid to keep it from falling. You do not have to remember which emirate lent to which or which company owed what to feel the shape of that gesture, a tower finished in defiance of a crisis, and a name that, on the night it opened, thanked the neighbor who had helped make sure it could still open at all. If your eyes have already closed somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right place to have let them close, because what remains of this story now is not calculation but simply light. Fireworks catching glass panels fixed years earlier by hands you have already spent this evening watching, and a crowd below craning their necks the way you once imagined yourself doing, looking up at something that had, by then, quietly become the tallest thing built by anyone, anywhere, in the whole of human memory. That is where this story comes to rest. Not at the topping out, not at the last rivet or the last pour, but at a renaming, a small human gesture folded into the base of an enormous physical one, the kind of detail that never shows up in a photograph of the skyline, but sits, once you know it, behind every photograph of that skyline all the same. And that is where I will leave you tonight, somewhere between the fireworks and the sand, between a tower that nearly didn't finish and a name that arrived only once it had. If you have been with me the whole way through, thank you for spending these 2 hours in the dark with a story about concrete and glass and the people who raised them a little at a time. And if you drifted off long before we got here, as you likely have and as you very much should have, none of this was going anywhere. It will still be standing here, half a mile of it, whenever you next want to walk back through it. Sleep well. I'll see you on the next one. The fireworks did not last long, in the end. They never do, against something that tall. They rose and broke and rose again, and then the sky over the tower simply went back to being sky, dark and wide and studded with the ordinary stars that had watched the whole thing rise course by course, night after night, for years before anyone outside the fence line thought to look up. Down at street level, the crowd began to thin the way crowds always do, cars pulling away from the barricades, families walking back toward the metro with their necks still a little sore from craning upward for so long. Somewhere in the tower's lower floors, a handful of engineers who had spent years arguing over wind loads and pump pressures stood quietly by a window, watching the last of the smoke drift off toward the Gulf, saying very little because there was very little left to say that the building itself was not already saying on their behalf. Above them, the glass held the last of the firelight for a moment longer than anything else on the skyline, then let it go, the way it would let go of the sun every evening after, for as long as it stood there. And it is still standing there now tonight, catching whatever light happens to be passing over it while you lie in the dark with your eyes closed, not needing to picture it at all, though you probably still are.